Hi all, hope you're doing great. This is Maro. So, I took a little break, 2 or so weeks, waited for the Commander rework to kind of sink in terms of, yes, it's here and it's in the game and you have to deal with it. I'm not big on change, so I just didn't feel like playing the game and managing that change at the same time. Now that some time has passed, I'm slowly easing in. I also got new data sets from MapleSyrup data that were published. And I was interested in looking at the full week before the introduction of the Commander rework and the full week after the Commander rework was introduced and see if there are any trends or changes that are worth discussing. In this video, I'm gonna primarily focus on battleships. I'm gonna look at battleships from tier 5 through tier 10. I'm also going to, I guess, create a, I'm going to create representative sample for a tier 10 battleship, tier 9 battleship, tier 8 battleships, and so on. And what that's going to do, it's going to show an average battleship in terms of statistics from MapleSyrup for the full week before the introduction of the rework and then the full week after, and just look at some comparisons. Now, all of this data is subject to change week to week because it's dependent on the players, the mix of players that are playing the ships, which servers, because they have some different underlying trends, or should I say metas perhaps, that vary from region to region. So every change doesn't necessarily mean this is just because of the commander rework. There could be some other noise there. But what I'm looking for are more changes in trends across multiple data points to suggest that the game or the ships are moving in one direction or the other. Initially, I was hoping to do this for battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, but then I realized that there is no way I can fit all of this in one video. So I'm hoping to break this work into 3 videos. Now, because I'm kind of looking in a great detail across all of these things, I think the number of slides that I ended up with was a little overwhelming. So it may be a little overwhelming for you guys as well. So I'm going to break out different parts so that perhaps you can just zoom in on the things that are of interest to you instead of watching the whole video. And the way that the video is broken into is, as I said, this representative T10 through T5. And then I go tier by tier. So T10, T9, T8, T7, T6, T5. The data in the order of slides is the same. So if you want to just skip ahead and go look at a specific tier, go ahead and do that. If not, you're welcome to watch the whole video as well. So with that, let me look into the representative battleship samples for different tiers. So the first slide is something I was interested in, just to see how the players are going to react. Are they going to be like me and be like, okay, well, I need a little break? Or are they just going to dive in? So here it's different data by tier, January 16 week ending and January 30th. So on top it's tier 10, and it basically shows in the data, MapleSyrup data, there was an increase in players playing tier 10 ships from 190 to 230. So that's 20% increase. Tier 9 about even. Again, there was an increase in tier 8. Then tier 7 about even. And then there was a decline in T5 and T6. And is that because these players decided to go and play some higher tier ships to see how the change impacts them, or is it just on and off kind of a change. It's not something I can tell. The second slide is to see the number of battles that these players played. So obviously there's an increase in tier 10 given the amount of players. Tier 9, it seems even the players that were left in that tier didn't necessarily play more battles. While in tier 8, it's about the same. Tier 7, tier 6, and tier 5, no change. So that would suggest even for the lower tiers, the remaining players played more battles. Moving on, the next slide is experience slide. Now this is something that introduces a lot of noise in general because it takes into consideration any flags you have, any camos you have. So it's not necessarily very representative on one for one. But the reason I wanted to take a look at it is in the trend in terms of change. And here we can see that from tiers 10 to tier 5, in all cases, the ships are earning less experience, which would suggest that the things that the game counts towards experience points, such as kills, such as damage, such as caps, spotting damage, we're seeing less of it. And it's a small difference in aggregate, but it's a difference nevertheless. So the very things that the game values, the commander rework devalues somewhat. I think that was maybe too smart of a play on words for me. But nevertheless, small changes across the board. And here is the average damage by tier and change week to week. And tier 10, slight increase. And then the rest of the tiers, slight decrease. So that means even the commander skills that encourage precision, accuracy, like the eagle eye, are not necessarily offsetting the change of increased distance that the battleships are shooting at. Now you can ask, well, wait a minute, how do you know that? How do you know that there is increased distance? And that's why I included bases captured stats in here, because closer you are to the enemy, more likely you are that eventually you will get to the cap and you will cap for your team. Now, battleships as a class don't really do it very often. I think when it comes to destroyers, these values will be 10 times as high. But what I thought was important to do is just take a look and see what the trend is. And if the trend shows that the battleships now are doing less capturing of the bases, less capping, that I'm making an assumption that that's because they're further away from the caps and they're maintaining the distance. And when you look at the slide, you can see that that holds across the tiers. I mean, to begin with, tier 10 was always even more distant than the other tiers. And I guess that speaks to the campy feel once you play tier 10s. But even across the other tiers, we're seeing this. So tier 10, tier 9, tier 8, tier 7, 6, 5, everybody's a little campier. So with that, let's go into specific tiers. Start with tier 10, and this is basically the number of battles. Thunderer keeps the top spot. Yamato and Grosker first follow. I think if you look at Thunderer, all the bottom ships from ARP Yamato to Kremlin, you're as likely to encounter a Thunderer as you are any of those ships. So I guess it just tells you how concentrated the tier 10 is. In the next slide, I wanted to take a look at change in terms of number of battles as a proxy for perhaps popularity. And here, for example, you can see gross curve first, 37% increase from the week of January 16th to the week of January 13th. Perhaps the players would like to test the new secondary builds on gross curve first. Conqueror is there, Republic, even Yamato. Thunder, not a lot of change, so it was very popular before, and it remains so. While Ohio and Vermont drop. Vermont especially 31% decline. Now that could be that the players are just done working on the US on the new US battleship line and are interested in testing other ships, so it doesn't necessarily speak to Vermont alone. And then Ohio, 7 or 8% decline. And if the secondary builds, especially when it comes to the US battleships, are not as good as they were, perhaps the players are either testing other builds or are just making a switch to the other battleships. Now, if we look at the win percentage, as of January 30th, Burgon, Shikishima, and Ohio are in top 3 slots. So Ohio still remains a very good ship. Now, the makeup of Shikishima and Slava, these are long-range snipers, clearly, and premium ships as well, clearly doing really well. Conqueror, also up there. Grosskurfürst, Republik, and Yamato continue to underperform. I think it's worth noting that ARP Yamato, the tier 10 for cash, is actually doing better than Yamato Tech 3 ship that presumably all the players had to grind through. Now, looking at the change in win percentage, and this is the absolute change. So if Shikishima was 51% the week of January 16th, now it would be 51.9 instead of relative. The reason I chose absolute was I just thought it would be easier to kind of internalize what the numbers meant versus the relative percentage performance. In any case, it shows improvement in Shikishima, ARP Yamato, Burgon. Not a big improvement, but sufficient. And then it shows Vermont and Ohio, and even Kremlin dropping in terms of win percentage. Now, again, as I've said, uh, change in numbers doesn't necessarily mean it's a trend or that it's a given, because so much depends on the underlying mix of players and regions. But I think it's interesting as it confirms what others have already said and what I think the player base in general believes when it comes to the impact of the commander change on Ohio or US secondary ships in general. Looking at the experience, Burgon again tops the list, Shikishima, Slava, Ohio. So that's a very familiar kind of order. And here, obviously, you would expect the premium ships, given the premium camouflage and so on, to even score more points. But it would appear that it, in general, kind of follows the win percentage. What's more interesting to me is the change week to week. So here, Ohio, Vermont, and Kremlin are earning less experience because they're doing less of what the game values and grades you on: damage, kills, caps, while Conqueror and Burgon appear to be doing better. In terms of damage, Burgon, Shikishima, Slava top the charts. You have Conqueror there and Thunderer, and Grosskurfürst and Kremlin are at the bottom. In terms of change, Burgon and Grosskurfürst and Conqueror are doing more damage than they did the week of January 16th, while again, Ohio and Vermont are doing less. So far, it's really consistent when it comes to the two US battleships. In terms of bases captured, Burgon, Kremlin, Ohio have the highest, well, are the top of the chart. Again, they would play closer to the other ships than the other tier 10 battleships, while ARP Yamato, Vermont, and Yamato would be the furthest. In terms of change, it's pretty much all negative. So Slava, fewer caps. And Slava, to begin with, is a long range sniper, so continues to be, maybe even more so. Ohio, so that's a brawling battleship, doing less. ARP Yamato, Conquer, Montana. I mean, in general, almost all, except for Gross First, are doing less capping. Some more, some are doing less more than the others. All right, so this is for tier 10. Again, it just kind of confirms some of the thoughts that were already out there. There is further distance between the battleships. They're staying further back. Tier 10 was the most campy to begin with. It remains so. Vermont and Ohio seem to be most negatively impacted by this change, while Bourgogne and Conqueror are having a more positive impact on them. So I think in the interest of time, given that there are a lot of slides to go through still, I'm going to just show the slides per tier, share a couple of just high level thoughts on each tier, and look to keep this video to some reasonable length. So here are tier 9 slides. Georgia remains one of the most popular ships. In terms of change, Sovrossia, huge increase in number in Bahi. But if you look in terms of how big of a share they have, they are not that much. And I think when it comes to Sovrossia change, it's very dependent on big increase on the Asia server. And that was followed with the increase in the win percentage as well. Now, I think some of the things that are very consistent is the decline in terms of experience for most of the tier 9 ships. I think obviously when it comes to damage, Musashi remains on top. But across the tier, it's more of a mixed picture, with Hizen and Georgia losing and the rest making up for it. In terms of bases captured, again, it's pretty consistent. Most of the ships are further away. Georgia, Bahi, Hizen. And I guess that's something that just confirms the overall slides, and it's in line with the tier 10 as well. All in all, I would say Georgia would appear to be the most impacted. These are not big changes, but they're small changes and are kind of consistent across different stats. I think I would the Sovetska Russia kind of discount the change in there. It's tied to a small number of players, predominantly on one server, and it could easily be that for whatever reason, just better players had a chance to play the ship and did well. Moving on to tier 8, Bismarck, very popular. North Carolina, Maggie, Massachusetts, top 4. In terms of change, people are playing less Kansas, Massachusetts. Champaign, pretty high number increase, even if it's a small base. In terms of win percentage, Massachusetts Black, Alitorio, Champaign. And it's very interesting that Champaign is as high as it is. I played Champaign, didn't do necessarily very well. I actually had a pretty bad string of games, but nevertheless, she's there. Roma, Littorio, Alabama are doing better in this current meta. And in terms of damage, Champagne, again, tops the charts, 78,000, way ahead. Alitorio and Roma. And Roma keeps popping up everywhere in terms of increase in battle change, in terms of increase in wins. Very interesting to see that that ship is doing better. And I don't know if it's because it's better players that are playing her and they're just testing the new framework using her, but it's an interesting change. In terms of bases captured, again, in most cases, most of the ships are doing a lot less of it. Overall, in terms of tier 8 battleships, Roma shows consistent and significant improvement, which is interesting. And Key, to some degree, shows to be doing worse. I think Massachusetts, maybe to some degree as well, but it still remains a good ship. So the change is not as bad as it may have appeared initially. Looking at Tier 7 battleships, Ganezao, Colorado, and Nagato lead the charts, three most popular Tier 7 battleships. Big change in terms of Strasbourg, but then a lot of players may have finished the campaign and got the ship. In terms of win percentage, Nelson on top. Somewhat surprisingly, Florida, second spot, and then Scharnhorst and Poltava. In terms of absolute change in percentage, Florida, the biggest change. Then we have California and Hood, while Poltava, Strasbourg, and Duke of York decline. In terms of experience, Florida again, so that's somewhat of a team, and Scharnhorst B, Nelson is there on top. In terms of change, California and Ashitaka actually, while most others have lost experience. In terms of damage, Nelson, King George the Fifth, Florida again. I'm very surprised to see Florida doing so well. Percentage change damage, Scharnhorst, Ganezao, California, Florida, Sinop, Leon, Nelson on the losing end. In terms of bases captured, Nelson, Scharnhorst, and Strasbourg again lead the charts. Loss consistent with all the other tiers. Most of the battleships are playing further apart. But I think what's interesting to note here is Nelson, a cheap, relatively speaking, premium ship and very popular premium ship, is doing rather very well. And Florida, which the feedback on Florida was mostly negative, but it appears that in comparison to other tier 7 ships, she's doing rather very well. So something to keep in mind. And with that, we come to tier 6. Fuso, New Mexico, and Bayern are the three most popular tier 6 battleships. In terms of change, it's moved towards German battleships, which is consistent with trying to explore how they brawl under the new commander rework. In terms of win percentage, West Virginia, Mutsu, and Prince Eitel Friedrich are the top three spots. And I have to admit I'm somewhat surprised by West Virginia 41 and Prince Eitel Friedrich being as high. And it seems under rework, West Virginia actually did even better. So something to keep in mind again. In terms of experience, consistent with the other tiers, primarily loss in experience, because the distance and what battleships are doing is not necessarily what the game scores. In terms of damage, West Virginia again on top, and Prince Eitel Friedrich in the third spot. In terms of damage, most battleships have lost, and here Arizona shows as minus 6%, but I think that's due to some other underlying factors in terms of the mix of players rather than just the ship not being as good. And again, in terms of capping, greater distance, less capping, consistent across the board. But the biggest surprise here for me in Tier 6 is how well West Virginia is doing, and it's doing even better, and Idle von Friedrich. I remember playing that ship, and I always mess up the name, but I remember playing that ship and hating it every second. And to see that that ship is doing so well in Tier 6, I have to say it's a really big surprise for me. And so, after a very long journey, we come to Tier 5 and the last tier. Uh, kind of glad that the end is near in terms of where we are. But looking at the Tier 5 ships, I think the whole series of slide can really be captured by just looking at Julius Caesare. That ship continues to dominate that tier and dominate it pretty convincingly. And it appears that this commander rework has done nothing but make the ship dominate even more in terms of experience, heads over heels. Heads over heels. I think heads over shoulders, I think is the expression I'm looking for. Change in experience, even Oklahoma and Julius Caesar, which is kind of interesting because Oklahoma, not a very popular ship. Again, in terms of damage, Julius Caesar, it's almost looking at a ship from a different galaxy. And I played Julius Caesar, and I guess I've done well enough in her, but I never thought that she was doing so much better than the rest of the tier. In terms of bases captured, I think that's one thing where Julius Caesar also takes a step back, unlike Oklahoma, and he increases the distance. But overall, it seems again a mixed bag, like with every other tier in terms of changes. I think It takes Julius Caesar and takes the best ship in the tier and makes her even better. So by leaps and bounds. That's all I have. I know it was a lot of slides, so I appreciate your patience. I always start these projects trying to come with something that's, not too long, that's somewhat direct and somewhat not too wordy. And in the end, I end up with a very long video. So I apologize for that. I guess what I'm going or trying to go for is being concise. Clearly, not excelling here. But if you did like this video, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. My hope is to have the videos on cruisers and destroyers out in coming days. I think working on this video it took longer than anticipated because there was a lot of stuff, and I know it's hard to believe, but there was even more stuff than what I've included in here in terms of data that I shifted through. But now that I have the format, I'm going to focus on trying to get those out as soon as I can. So that's it from me. I wish you the best of luck on the high seas. Maro, out.